There's a moment in every man's life when he realizes the worst thing he ever did wasn't a crime. It wasn't a betrayal. It wasn't a war. It was a dinner table, and the woman sitting across from him, the one he'd reduced to silence, to invisibility, to a kind of living furniture, she was the only reason he was still breathing. This is that story. Too, his name was Dante Caruso. And if you grew up in the kind of neighborhood where that name meant something, you already know what kind of man we're talking about. Not the Hollywood version. Not the romanticized figure with the slicked back hair and the moral code that makes you root for him anyway. The real version. The one that exists in kitchens and parking lots and back offices with the blinds drawn. The kind of man who made decisions that rippled outward like stones thrown into still water, and never once watched to see where the ripples landed. He was 51 years old. He had grey at his temples that women described as distinguished and men described with a different kind of respect. He wore suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and he wore them the way certain men do, not to impress, but because the armor had become so familiar he'd forgotten it was armor at all. He had 3 phones. He had 2 cars. He had a house in a part of the city where the streets were quiet not because they were safe, but because everyone on them understood the same unspoken language. And he had a wife. Her name was Alina. She was 44. She had dark hair she kept pulled back, because she'd learned early that certain things about herself were better kept contained. She had a way of moving through a room that was almost architectural, precise, efficient, taking up exactly the space she needed, and not 1 inch more. She'd trained herself into that. It hadn't always been her nature. She cooked every evening. She kept the house in a way that Dante would never notice unless it slipped, and it never slipped. She attended the dinners that were necessary for her to attend. She smiled at the right moments. She spoke carefully and not often. She had learned, over 22 years of marriage to Dante Caruso, that the most effective form of survival was to become nearly invisible. Not because he hit her. Let that be clear from the start. There are men who use their hands and men who use something quieter and more pervasive. Dante Caruso used the quieter thing. He used dismissal. He used the specific architecture of a man who has decided, somewhere along the way, probably without even fully realizing it, that the woman he married exists primarily as a function, a presence, a background element, like the furniture that only gets noticed when it's broken. He'd stopped looking at her somewhere around year 7, not dramatically, not with a fight. It happened the way most slow erosions happen, gradually, and then all at once, and then so completely that the original state becomes almost impossible to remember. He'd introduced her at a dinner once. This was maybe 12 years ago, and one of his associates had leaned over and said something quietly to him, and Dante had laughed. Elena had been standing close enough to hear the comment. It wasn't violent. It wasn't even particularly cruel by the standards of the world they moved in. The man had said something about how a woman like that must have been something to look at once, and Dante had laughed, not corrected, not turned cold, not pulled Elena closer in the quiet way that would have said everything without saying anything at all. He had laughed, and Elena had stood there, holding her wine glass, and she had understood something with absolute clarity in that moment. The kind of clarity that doesn't hurt immediately because the understanding is too complete to process in real time. It settles later, in the car on the way home, in the bathroom before bed, in the particular quality of silence that fills a room when 2 people have been sleeping beside each other for over a decade and have run out of anything that resembles genuine contact. She had understood that she was alone, not in the way single people are alone, in the specific, suffocating way that only married people can experience, surrounded by the trappings of connection, embedded in the structures of partnership, and completely, fundamentally isolated. She had gone home that night, and she had made a decision. Not a dramatic one, not the kind of decision that gets made in movies, where a woman stares into a mirror and something shifts in her eyes, and you understand that everything is about to change. This was quieter than that, more pragmatic. She had decided that she would survive this, that whatever this marriage had become, she would not become less than what she already was in the process of enduring it. She would not disappear. She would simply become very, very careful about where she chose to be seen. The first years of the marriage had not been like this. That needs to be said, because every story of erosion has a beginning that looked different, and to skip it is to misunderstand the nature of what was lost. There was a time, early, before the weight of what Dante was had fully expressed itself in the shape of their daily life, when he had looked at her, when he had been curious about her, when the specific intelligence she brought to everything she touched had been something he noticed and turned toward, rather than something he moved through without seeing. They had met at a dinner. Not one of his dinners, someone else's. A mutual friend had placed them at the same end of the table, which was either very deliberate or very fortunate, depending on how you chose to interpret the mechanics of how people find each other. Dante had been 31. Elena had been 24. She had been wearing something dark blue, and she had been talking about something with complete absorption. He could not now remember what. Only the quality of her attention, the way she moved her hands when she was thinking through something complex, and he had watched her for a long time before she noticed him watching. When she'd turned and found him looking, she hadn't performed surprise or pleasure or any of the things that women sometimes perform when they find men of a certain type looking at them. She had just looked back, steady and direct, the look of a person who is not afraid of being seen, which was, he would later understand, because she did not yet know enough to be afraid. He had found this extraordinarily attractive. Not the dark blue thing, not the hands, though those too. The steadiness, the directness, the sense of a person who was entirely present in her own life. He had made his way to her end of the table inside of 20 minutes. They had talked for 3 hours. She was not from his world. This was apparent immediately, and it was, he told himself at the time, part of the appeal. She was from a family that had nothing to do with the particular ecosystem he moved in. Her father was an architect. Her mother had been a teacher before she died, which had happened when Elena was 19, and the weight of that loss was something Elena carried in a way that was private and complete, not performed for sympathy. She had a degree in something to do with food science, which she'd used to work for 2 years in a restaurant kitchen, before deciding that the professional kitchen environment was not the right container for the kind of relationship she wanted to have with food. He had found all of this interesting. He had found her interesting, not as a curiosity, not with the condescending interest of a man cataloguing the details of a person who is unlike him, with the genuine, engaged interest of someone encountering a kind of intelligence they hadn't expected. They were married 2 years later. The first years were good. There is no honest accounting of what happened later that doesn't acknowledge this plainly. The first years were genuinely good. He was attentive. He asked questions. He came home for dinner most nights and sat at the table and ate what she'd made and talked to her about things that were real. She made him laugh, which was not something many people could do, because his sense of humor was specific and dry and required a particular kind of quickness to meet it. She made him laugh, and she challenged him, and she pushed back on things when she disagreed, which she did with the same directness. She'd shown at that first dinner, calm, precise, without aggression, but without yielding either. He had found this attractive too in the early years. He had called it strength. Later, when the marriage had contracted to its current shape, he would recognize that what had changed was not her. She was still doing the same thing. The directness, the pushback, the precision. What had changed was his relationship to it. At some point it had shifted from attractive to inconvenient, from strength to obstruction. At some point he had stopped wanting to be challenged and had started wanting to be agreed with, and Elena, who had not received the memo and would not have complied with it anyway, had become, in the specific logic of that shift, a problem he solved by simply not engaging. He didn't leave. That option probably never seriously occurred to him. He was from a world where marriages were permanent, practically speaking, and Elena had done nothing that constituted grounds for anything. She was present and competent and beautiful in the specific, understated way she'd always been beautiful, and she ran the house and attended the necessary dinners and smiled at the right moments. She just stopped being a person to him and became a function. And the tragedy of it, the specific, quiet tragedy that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't have a dramatic shape or a climactic moment, was that she knew exactly when it happened. She could date it almost precisely. Not the year 7 thing, not the dinner where he'd laughed at the comment. Earlier than that. She could trace it to a specific conversation in a specific room on a specific evening, when she had said something real to him. Something about the way she was feeling about a situation, something vulnerable and genuine and carefully offered. And he had looked at his phone. Not rudely. He hadn't dismissed her. He'd looked at his phone the way men do when they have many things requiring their attention, and one of those things is more urgent than another. And the one that is more urgent is not the conversation they are currently having. He had looked at his phone, and she had stopped mid-sentence. And he hadn't noticed that she'd stopped. She had sat with that for a long time afterward. Had turned it over the way you turn over something that doesn't feel right, checking it from different angles, trying to find the interpretation that makes it less than what it is. She had tried hard to find that interpretation, because the alternative, the clear, accurate reading of what had just happened, was something she was not ready to accept. She eventually accepted it, and then she began the long, quiet work of building herself a life inside the life she had. The dinner happened on a Thursday in October. Dante had people over. This was not unusual. The house was used for dinners with some regularity, business dinners, though they were never called that. They were called dinners. The business was implicit, woven into the conversation and the wine selection, and the particular way certain topics were approached, and then set aside like dishes that had served their purpose. There were 8 people at the table that night. Dante at the head. Elena at the other end, which was its own kind of statement, the length of a dining table as a metaphor for the distance between 2 people who technically shared a bed. She had cooked. She always cooked for these dinners, not because Dante had asked her to, but because it was one of the few things she did in this life that was genuinely and entirely hers. She cooked with a precision and an intelligence that the people sitting at that table could taste, but probably couldn't articulate. She understood flavor the way she understood most things, structurally, at the level of how things hold together, what makes something work. That night she had made a lamb dish with pomegranate and something else, a spice combination she'd spent 3 days refining. It was, by any objective measure, exceptional. Nobody said anything about it, or rather, the men made the sounds men make when they are eating, and the food is good, and they are too preoccupied with the conversation. They're not officially having to formally acknowledge what's in front of them. There was a man at the table named Richie who had the specific quality of attention that made Alana vaguely uncomfortable, not threatening, exactly, but assessing, the way certain people look at things to determine their value rather than to appreciate them. About 40 minutes into dinner, Dante made a comment. This is the part of the story that matters. The dinner was the frame. The comment was the thing inside the frame. He'd been talking, they all had, in the circling way of these evenings, and the conversation had turned, as conversations in rooms like that sometimes do, to the subject of women. Not explicitly, not crudely, but the undertow was there, the current beneath the surface language, and it pulled the room in a particular direction. One of the men, a younger one, mid-30s, with the energy of someone still trying to prove things, had made an observation. Something about his own wife. Something about the particular challenge of being married to a woman who had opinions. He said it with a smile that was meant to be charming, the kind of smile that asks the room to confirm a shared understanding. Dante had looked up from his plate. He looked toward Elena, and he said, in the specific, performative tone of a man playing to a room, At least yours talks. There was laughter, not from everyone, but from enough. And Elena sat at the other end of the table, and she put down her fork very carefully, and she looked at her husband, and she did not react. She had been practicing not reacting for a very long time. She had become expert at it. She picked her fork back up. She took a sip of water, not wine water, and she looked out the window at the garden she maintained alone, and she thought about something completely unrelated, which was whether the lemon tree needed more water or less. The dinner continued. Nobody looked at her after that. Or rather, they looked the way people look at something they've agreed not to acknowledge. The studied non-look. The active absence of gaze. She collected plates. She served dessert. She poured coffee. She moved through the remainder of the evening with the practiced ease of someone who has learned to keep functioning on the surface, while something else entirely is happening underneath. There is a specific kind of endurance that women who are very intelligent and very invisible develop over long years of exactly this kind of evening. It is not numbness. Numbness implies the absence of feeling. What Elena had developed was something different, a capacity to feel the thing fully, completely, without allowing it to show, and then to set it aside with a precision that was almost mechanical. To compartmentalize not in the unhealthy, dissociative sense, but in the way of a person who has learned that the feeling exists and can be returned to and processed. But that this room, this table, this particular moment, is not the place for it. She would process it later. In the garden, probably. Or in the kitchen in the early morning before the house was awake, when she could stand at the counter with her coffee and look out at the light coming through the trees and let herself feel what she felt without anyone watching. She was, in her way, very good at being alone. Later, after the guests had gone and the house was quiet, Dante sat in the living room with a glass of something and his phone, and Elena washed the dishes by hand, even though they had a dishwasher, because the physical act of it was something she found grounding. The warm water, the weight of the plates, the simple, honest cause and effect of the thing. He didn't say anything. He didn't apologize. The thought probably didn't occur to him that there was anything to apologize for. This was the nature of the man he'd become, or maybe the nature of the man he'd always been, gradually made legible by proximity and time. He had made a joke. The room had laughed. He had moved on. Elena dried her hands on a dish towel and looked out the window above the sink at the garden. The lemon tree, she decided, could probably use more water. What Elena did in the mornings, in the hours before the house had fully woken, was her own. She had claimed these hours deliberately. Not dramatically. She hadn't announced anything, hadn't made a declaration. She had simply begun, several years ago, to wake earlier. First by 30 minutes, then by an hour, eventually by 2 hours, which gave her the span of time between 4:30 and 6:30 that was, in every practical sense, entirely hers. She read. She had always been a reader, but the morning reading was different from the evening reading, less recreational, more purposeful. She was working through something, not a program, not a formal course of study, but the kind of self-directed education that happens when a very intelligent person finds themselves with significant amounts of internal time and uses it well. She had read extensively about nutrition and the science of food, which fed directly into the cooking and gave her already substantial instincts a structural framework she found deeply satisfying. She had read about botany, which fed into the garden. She had read about architecture, which was her father's domain, and which she'd circled back toward in middle life with a kind of renewed attention. She had read about psychology, not self-help, not the popular psychology of the airport bookstore, but actual psychology, the kind that requires patience and a tolerance for uncertainty. She had read, recently and with great care, about cardiology. This had not been random. She had found the medication bottle 14 months ago. Not snooping. She wasn't a person who searched through things. She had found it in the bathroom cabinet when she was looking for something else. A prescription bottle with a name she didn't recognize, attached to instructions she didn't immediately understand. She had looked at it for a moment and put it back exactly where it was. That evening she had looked up the medication name, and then she had read for 3 evenings straight, with the focused, systematic attention she brought to everything she decided to understand. She had read about the condition, about what it meant, and what the range of outcomes was, and what the variables were that moved the needle in one direction or the other. She had read about diet and its specific relevance, about stress and its specific relevance, about the medications used to manage the condition and what they did and what their interactions were. She had not asked Dante about it. She had considered asking him. She had run through the conversation in her head several times, the opening, his likely response, the range of directions it could go, and she had concluded each time that asking would produce less useful information than not asking. If she asked, he would deny or minimize or redirect, and she would lose the window of honest information she currently had. If she didn't ask, she could go on learning. She could build an accurate picture without the interference of his version of it. So she had kept reading, and she had, in the most practical, unglamorous way possible, prepared herself. Not dramatically, not with any sense that she was heroically preparing for a crisis, simply because she was the kind of person who, once she understood that a thing was possible, made sure she understood what to do if it happened. She bought aspirin and put it in a specific place. She reviewed several times the information about what to do in the relevant emergency. She knew the number to call and what to say when she called it. She had the address of the nearest hospital with the relevant cardiac unit. She did all of this the way she did most things, quietly, efficiently, without telling anyone. This is the thing about invisible women. The assumption, from the outside, is that invisibility means passivity, that the woman who doesn't speak is the woman who doesn't think, that the woman who moves through rooms without demanding attention is the woman who has nothing to offer. The truth is almost always the opposite. Invisible women see everything. They have the attention of people who are not performing, not managing an audience, not occupied with their own presentation. They watch. They listen. They notice the things that visible people are too busy being visible to catch. Elena Caruso had been watching Dante for 14 months, with the focused, careful attention of a person who understands that the information she is collecting might one day matter very much. She was right. 3 weeks after the dinner, they found out someone had been talking. In the world Dante Caruso occupied, information was its own kind of currency, and someone, somewhere in the architecture of relationships and arrangements and careful understandings that constituted his particular life, had been spending that currency in places he hadn't authorized. The discovery of this happened the way these things always happen in that world, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a conversation in a quiet place between people who already knew most of the answer and were simply confirming the last piece of it. Dante found out on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, the information had moved through the relevant channels and produced the relevant responses. This is not, at its core, a story about that, about the business side of things, about the specific mechanics of how Dante Caruso dealt with threats and leaks, and the particular men who thought they could operate in both directions at once. It's relevant only because of what it set in motion, because the stress of those weeks, and they were genuinely stressful, even for a man who had spent decades functioning under that particular kind of pressure, had pushed Dante into old habits. He was eating badly. He was sleeping less. He was drinking more than he should have been, not dramatically, but consistently, the way a man does when he reaches for a familiar mechanism without fully acknowledging that he's reaching. Elena watched this. She watched him come home later and later, watched the way he held his shoulders differently, higher, tighter, watched the way he ate standing over the kitchen counter at 11 at night, which was something he only did when the pressure of something specific had compressed his appetite down to refueling rather than eating. She watched him pour the second drink, and sometimes the third, with the particular efficient motion of a man who is not enjoying the drink but using it. She didn't say anything. There was nothing she could say that would be heard, and more to the point, it was not her information to offer. She couldn't tell him what she knew without revealing that she knew it, and revealing that she knew it would open a conversation she couldn't fully control. So she watched. She cooked things that were specifically good for him in ways that she kept unannounced. There was no performance of care, no pointed commentary about what she'd included and why. She just made food that was what his body needed and put it in front of him and left it there for him to eat or not. He mostly ate it. Not noticing what it was or why, but eating it. This is its own small thing. This is the quiet intelligence of a woman taking care of a man who has no idea he is being taken care of, who would not, in the current architecture of their marriage, accept being taken care of if he knew it was happening. The care had to be invisible to function, so she made it invisible. This required a specific kind of grace, the grace of giving without the transaction, without the acknowledgement, without the return. She had gotten very good at this. The weeks stretched on. The situation with the leak resolved itself, in the way these situations resolve themselves, not cleanly, not without cost, but sufficiently. The household tension began to ease by degrees. Dante slept more. He came home earlier on some evenings. The shoulders dropped back toward their normal position. But the damage had been done. 3 weeks of compounded stress on a cardiovascular system that was already operating with a structural vulnerability. This was not nothing. Elena understood this from her reading. She watched him with the particular, precise attention of someone who knows what they're looking for. She started keeping the aspirin closer. The night it happened was a Saturday in November. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists in certain neighborhoods, in certain seasons, when the temperature has dropped enough to keep people indoors, and the streets have that particular emptiness that feels both peaceful and slightly ominous, depending on your relationship with solitude. They had eaten dinner. Not together. Dante had eaten at his desk, which was not unusual, and Elena had eaten in the kitchen, which was also not unusual, and this was simply the topography of their evenings by this point. Parallel lives conducted in adjacent spaces, occasionally intersecting at the functional level, a question about the week, a logistical exchange, the minimum necessary communication of two people who shared a house and a name and not much else. Elena had been reading. She did this most evenings. She had always been a reader, had always needed it the way certain people need movement or music, needed the specific kind of interiority it provided. She read in the living room on the smaller couch, the one by the window, and Dante was in his office with the door mostly closed. The house had the specific feeling of late autumn evenings, warm inside, cold pressing at the windows, the particular companionable quality of two people in proximity without engagement. She had her book. She had her tea. The lamp on the side table made the kind of light that is specifically good for reading, warm and directed. And outside the window the garden was dark, and the lemon tree was a shape against the ambient glow of the city's edge. She read for perhaps an hour and a half. Around 9:30 she heard something, not dramatic, not a crash, not the sounds that signal immediate emergency in the obvious register, something subtler than that. A quality of silence following a small sound, the particular negative space that exists when a normal, ambient sound stops in an abnormal way. The specific kind of nothing that is different from ordinary nothing. She put down her book. She sat very still for a moment, the way animals go still when they have registered something, before they've identified what it is. All her perceptual systems redirected at once toward the source of the not quite sound. Then she stood up and walked to the office. The door was mostly closed. She pushed it open. Dante was at his desk. He had been writing something. There was a pen in his hand, and he was in the process of becoming very still in the way that bodies do when they are in serious distress. Not unconscious, still present, but the particular grey that had come into his face was not a normal grey, and the way his left hand was pressed flat against the desk was not normal, and the specific quality of his breathing, when she registered it, was not normal. She had 4 seconds of looking at him, where she had an entire other lifetime available to her. This is the honest truth of the moment, and it deserves to be said plainly in those 4 seconds. Elena Caruso had a complete and available choice. She knew this with the same clarity with which she had understood things at that dinner table 12 years ago. She knew that she could be slow. She could be uncertain. She could do things in the wrong order. She could let the normal human panic of the moment work against speed in a situation where speed was everything. She could also do something else. She could let the person she had become, the careful, invisible, self-preserving person she had built herself into over 22 years of this marriage, she could let that person operate, slowly, uncertainly, in the way that would produce the outcome that the slow, uncertain version of events produces. She stood in the doorway for 4 seconds, and then she moved. This is the part of the story where most people, if they were telling it, would slow down, would reach for the dramatic language, would describe what happened next in terms that are designed to create a particular emotional response. What happened was profoundly competent. And competence, real competence, the kind forged out of years of paying attention and keeping information and making decisions in the quiet, unglamorous spaces where nobody is watching. Competence is its own kind of remarkable. She called the ambulance first. Clear address, clear description of symptoms, clear request for what was needed. She had the information correct because she had, over the past 14 months, quietly and without telling him, educated herself about the condition he didn't know she knew he had. She had read. She had looked things up. She had understood. With the particular intelligence of a woman who has accepted that she must prepare for things alone, that she needed to know what she was dealing with, she got the aspirin. She knew which one, and she knew the dose, and she knew why, and she did this with the efficiency of someone who has rehearsed a thing she hoped she would never need. She got to him. She stayed with him. And this is the part, the specific, quiet, unremarkable part, that is actually the center of the whole story. She talked to him, not with panic, not with the desperate emotional quality of a person coming apart at the edges. Steadily, calmly. The same voice she used for everything, for the garden, for the kitchen, for the evenings when she sat by herself and read her books. She talked to him in that voice. She told him the ambulance was coming. She told him to stay with her. She told him that she needed him to keep his eyes open and keep breathing. She told him about the lemon tree. She told him that the tree was going to have a good year. She could already see it in the way the new growth was coming in, the specific quality of the new leaves, the way the branches were holding themselves. She told him this in the same tone she would have used to tell him over dinner if they had still been the kind of people who talked over dinner. Matter of fact, present. She told him that he needed to hear this, that she needed him to stay awake and listen to her, because she had things to tell him, and she intended to tell them properly. She didn't say, "I love you." She didn't make a dramatic speech. She didn't perform the emotion that the moment might have seemed to call for. She just kept talking, steady and present and completely, entirely there. And he stayed with her. The ambulance came in 9 minutes. She had given them the information they needed to bring the right equipment. She had unlocked the front door before they arrived. She had his medication information written on a piece of paper, the paper she had prepared, quietly and without drama, and kept in a specific drawer, and she handed it to the first paramedic without being asked. They worked with the efficiency of people who do this, and know how to do it, and she stepped back and let them work, and she stood in the doorway of his office, and she watched them, and her face was very still. One of the paramedics, a young woman with the focused, unruffled quality of someone very good at a hard job, glanced at her as they were preparing to move him. "Are you all right?" the paramedic said. Elena looked at her. "Yes," she said. And then, "Please take good care of him." The paramedic held her gaze for a moment, and then nodded once and turned back to the work. 2. He was in the hospital for 9 days. The first 3 days were the kind that doctors describe with careful language, that means this is serious, and we are not yet certain. The next three were the kind that mean the serious part appears to be resolving. The last three were the kind that mean we need to observe further and give the body time, and there are things you are going to need to change. Elena was there every day. She drove herself. She arrived in the mornings after the early hours she'd claimed for her own. The reading, the garden, the particular quality of early morning that was hers, and she stayed through the afternoon. She went home in the evenings to feed herself and sleep, and then she came back, not performing, not making a display of devoted wifeliness for an audience, because there was no audience, and even if there had been, she was long past the stage of her life where she performed for rooms. She was there because he was there, and because he needed things, and because, and this part is complicated and deserves to be treated as such, because he was still her husband, and whatever the marriage had become, whatever its failures and its silences and its particular architecture of distance, there was something underneath all of it that was still real. Not romantic, necessarily. Not the warm, glowing thing that the word love conjures in its easier configurations. Something older and more honest than that. Something that had survived 22 years of the slow erosion of everything prettier, and had turned into something harder and less easy to name. She brought things. His specific tea, he had always had a particular tea, one of those consistent small details that persist in a person long after the larger things have shifted. She found the tea in the kitchen cabinet, where it had always been, and she'd brought it with the travel mug. She'd bought for exactly this kind of situation. She brought books, which was interesting since she didn't know exactly what he was reading these days, so she made judgments based on what she knew of him from a long time ago, which turned out to be more accurate than she'd expected. She brought a change of clothes. She coordinated with the people who needed to be coordinated with, because in the world Dante occupied, 9 days of unexpected absence required management, and she was capable of the management. She understood, with complete clarity, that the world he operated in would not run itself in his absence. It would require someone who understood its shape. Not the specific operational details, those were handled by the people who handled them, but the shape, the logic, the particular sensitivities of the relationships involved. Who needed to be reassured and how? Who needed to be kept at a specific distance and why? What could wait and what could not? She knew all of this. 22 years of being present in the rooms where this world operated had given her a detailed and accurate map of its terrain, even though she had always been the background of those rooms, rather than the foreground. You learn a great deal about the architecture of a house when you are the one maintaining it. She made the calls that needed to be made. She said the things that needed to be said. She did it with the specific, contained efficiency that was simply her manner, and nobody who received those calls would have known anything from her voice, except that the situation was being managed and that they should continue to manage their respective parts of it. He watched her do these things on the 4th day, when the serious part was resolving, and he was conscious and present, and beginning to be himself again in the specific, uncomfortable way of recovery, when you are no longer frightened enough to be small and humble, but not yet recovered enough to be the large version of yourself that you prefer. On the 4th day, he watched her pour the tea into the cup she'd brought from home, because he didn't like the hospital cups, and he had a specific kind of experience. Not an epiphany. Don't call it an epiphany. That word implies something sudden, something lightning strike, something that rewrites a person in a moment of divine clarity. That's not what this was. This was something slower and more uncomfortable than an epiphany. It was a reckoning. He watched her pour the tea. And he watched her hands, hands he had not really looked at in years, and he thought about the dinner. Not the specific one with the comment and the laughter, though that one was part of it. He thought about the shape of the dinners, the architecture of 22 years of evenings, the accumulated weight of all the moments in which he had looked through her or around her, or had used her presence in a room as a backdrop for something he considered more important. He thought about the fact that she had known about his heart. He knew she'd known the aspirin, the specific aspirin, the way she'd moved, the call she'd made, the information she'd relayed that was too precise to be accidental knowledge. She had known, and she had not told him she knew, which meant she had found out on her own, and finding out on her own meant she had been watching. Carefully, in that quiet, attentive way of hers. Watching him even when he had stopped watching her. He thought about this. He thought about the specific quality of attention it required, the sustained, focused, intelligent attention to do what she had done that Saturday night. The preparation, the knowing where the aspirin was, the having the paper with his medications already written out and ready, the knowing what to say to the dispatcher. None of that had been improvised. All of it had been built, carefully and without announcement, over 14 months of watching and learning and preparing. She had done all of that for him, who had stood at a dinner table and made a joke at her expense and let a room full of men laugh at it, and then moved on as though nothing had happened. The weight of this was not comfortable. He was not the kind of man who found discomfort of this particular kind easy to sit with. His relationship with accountability, real accountability, the internal kind, not the performed version, was not well developed. He had spent 51 years in a world where accountability was primarily something you demanded from other people and avoided for yourself, and the habit of avoidance was deeply grooved. But he was in a hospital bed. He could not stand up. He could not walk to a different room. He could not occupy himself with the 100 operational demands that normally insulated him from the kind of thinking he was currently doing. He had nothing to do except lie there and look at his hands and feel the weight of it. She handed him the cup. He took it. She looked at him when she did it, not pointedly, not with any indication that she was waiting for something, just looked at him the way she looked at everything. Steadily, directly. He said her name. Just that, just her name. She looked up, and something happened in the space of that looking up. Something that neither of them commented on. Because they were both the kind of people who don't comment on things like that, who understand that some things are precise enough to be ruined by language. He held the cup in both hands. She sat down in the chair beside the bed. They didn't say anything for a while. The hospital made its hospital sounds around them. Distant, institutional, the specific ambient quality of a place that contains a lot of human fragility in its rooms, and they sat in the middle of it, a man holding a cup of tea and a woman sitting beside him, and the silence between them was different from the silence that had been the texture of their evenings for the past decade. That silence had been the silence of people who have stopped trying. This was the silence of people who are, tentatively and uncertainly, about to start. He came home on a grey November afternoon with a list of things he was supposed to do and not do, and a follow-up appointment, and the particular fragility of a large man who has been reminded by his own body that it has limits and opinions, and that it intends to enforce them regardless of his preferences. The house was the same. Of course it was. Houses don't change. The garden was the same. The kitchen was the same. His office was the same. Though Elena had been in it while he was away, there were small signs, the kind she would have left unconsciously, the particular way things were slightly more organized than they would be if he'd left them. She had been in his space. Not intrusively. Nothing had been moved in any meaningful sense, and nothing had been taken or examined. But she had been there, she had tidied. She had done this the way she did everything in the house, as a matter of course, without drama, as part of the basic work of maintaining. He stood in the doorway of his office and looked at this for a moment. Then he went to the kitchen, where she was. She made dinner. Not the kind she made for the business dinners. Not the lamb dish with the pomegranate and the 3 days of refining. Something simpler. Something that had been calibrated, without being performed, to be exactly what a body needed after 9 days in a hospital, warm, not heavy, with the specific combination of things that she understood, from years of reading and paying attention, would support rather than complicate the healing. He sat at the table. She sat at the table, not at opposite ends. This is a small thing, but it mattered. She sat at the side, close enough that the table between them was a surface rather than a statement. He noticed this. He didn't say anything about it, but he noticed. They ate, and something new happened, which was almost nothing, which was they talked. Not about important things. Not about the 9 days or the heart, or the marriage or the dinner party, or the 12 years of accumulated distance. Those conversations, if they happened at all, would happen later and slowly, and with the inevitable false starts and backtracking of people who have been out of the practice of genuine conversation for a very long time. They talked about the garden. He asked about the lemon tree. He'd noticed it from the window when they'd come in. Noticed that it looked different, better, than it had in the fall, and she told him about the watering adjustment she'd made. He listened. He asked a follow-up question. It was a genuine follow-up question, the kind that signals actual interest rather than conversational maintenance. She noticed this and did not comment on it and answered the question. They talked about the lemon tree for maybe 6 or 7 minutes. It was a conversation about almost nothing. It was also the most real conversation they had had in several years. After dinner he went to his office. But the door stayed open. She washed the dishes by hand, as she always did, and she looked out the window at the dark garden, and the lemon tree was a shape against the faint ambient light. And she stood there for a while with her hands in the warm water, and she felt something that was not quite hope, and not quite relief, and not quite grief, but something that contained elements of all three. She felt the weight of the years, not bitterly, not with the specific sharpness of injury, just the weight, the fact of how long it had taken, the fact of what it had taken, a cardiac event, 9 days in a hospital, the prospect of mortality made suddenly proximate and real, the specific, irreversible fact of you almost weren't here, and now you are, and something about that changes the calculation. She wondered, standing at the sink with her hands in the water, whether this would last, whether the shift she could feel in him, still tentative, still fragile as new growth, would survive the return to ordinary life. Whether the man who came back from a hospital humbled would remain humbled once the humbling conditions were removed. Whether the open door was the beginning of something or an artifact of a temporary state, she did not know. She realized, genuinely uncertain, which was itself something. For a long time she had been not uncertain about this. She had been finished in a quiet internal way. Not gone, not planning to leave, but finished in the sense of no longer expecting anything. And now there was, despite everything, something that functioned like expectation, something that was watching to see what would happen next. She found this uncomfortable. It was easier in some ways not to expect anything. Expectation requires vulnerability. Expectation means you can be disappointed, and she had become, over the years, very efficient at not being disappointed because she had stopped hoping for anything to disappoint her. She dried her hands. She left the kitchen light on and went to read. The door to his office was still open. 2. The weeks that followed were not a transformation. Let that be clear, because the idea of transformation, sudden, complete, permanent, is a useful fiction that we reach for when we want a story to have the satisfying shape of redemption. Dante Caruso did not transform. He was 51 years old, and he had been who he was for the entirety of those years, and that is not a thing that transforms, not suddenly, not completely, possibly not permanently. What happened instead was something more honest and more difficult. He began, gradually, and with significant resistance from all the habits of a lifetime, to pay attention, not with the specific operational attention he brought to every other area of his life. Not strategically, not as a project, but with something more tentative and unfamiliar than that. The kind of attention you bring to something when you've realized, with the particular clarity of a hospital bed, that you had not been bringing it. He watched her in the kitchen, not intrusively, not in a way he announced or that called attention to itself. He simply looked at her hands, at the specific intelligence she brought to the physical work of it, at the way she moved through the space with that precise, contained efficiency that had taken him 22 years to recognize as something she had built on purpose. He started asking questions, small ones at first, about the food, about the garden, about things she read. He'd pick up one of her books and turn it over and ask what it was about, and she'd tell him, and he'd listen. And then sometimes he'd ask another question, and sometimes he'd put it down and that was the end of it. But the asking, the noticing that there was something to ask about, this was new. Elena noticed. She would not have said she was cautious about it, because cautiousness implies a fear of something specific, and what she felt was more diffuse than fear. She was simply very careful not to need it too much, not to reach toward this new, tentative attention too eagerly, not to shape her behavior around the receiving of it. She had spent a long time not needing him to look at her, and she had constructed something real and functional in that not needing, and she was not prepared to dismantle it on the strength of a shift that might or might not be durable. But she noticed, and something in her, the thing underneath the careful, self-preserving architecture, the original thing that had existed before the dinner table and the 12 years of looked through. Ness, something in her noticed back. There were setbacks. This needs to be said, because a clean account of a gradual shift is dishonest. He had moments of reverting. Moments when the habits of a lifetime reasserted themselves fully, when he was dismissive, when he was absent in the old familiar way, when he used the particular mechanism of not quite contempt that had become his default mode of relating to her. These moments happened, and they were real, and they had the specific quality of proof that can make a person feel that nothing has actually changed, that the appearance of change is itself the illusion. She handled these moments with a discipline that she found, to her own mild surprise, she possessed. She named them, not explosively, not with the weight of all the accumulated years behind the naming. Quietly. She would say, "That's not okay," and she would look at him and let it sit, and then she would continue what she was doing. No extended processing. No requirement for a response. Just the clear, direct fact of that thing you just did. That's not okay. He learned to hear it. Not immediately. Not without resistance. There were moments when the naming was met with the specific, brittle defensiveness of a man who has spent a long time not being named. But she did not escalate. She did not require him to collapse into apology or spend hours untangling it. She said the thing and moved on, and somehow the moved on was its own kind of power. It communicated, "I have said what needs to be said, and I am not dependent on your response to it. The thing needed saying. It has been said. We continue." This was not what he was used to. He was used to women in his world who either capitulated or exploded, because those were the two available modes in the environment he'd operated in, and he had learned to manage both. This third thing, the quiet, the naming, the continued on-ness, he did not have a mechanism for managing, so instead he found himself, gradually and with resistance, listening. He told her about the heart. This happened about 3 weeks after he came home. On a Tuesday evening, he came into the kitchen while she was making tea, and he stood at the counter and he told her. He told her about the cardiologist, the street on the other side of the city, the parking structure, the diagnosis, the sitting in the car afterward. He told her the specific name of the condition, and what the doctor had said it meant, and what he'd been told to do and not do. He told her that he hadn't told her. He didn't offer an explanation for why. He didn't construct a story about it. He just said, "I didn't tell you." He left the why hanging in the air, which was actually more honest than any explanation would have been. Because the why was the whole thing, the whole 22 years of it, and any single articulation of it would have reduced it. She listened. She was still holding her mug. She had turned to look at him when he started, and she'd stayed looking at him through the telling of it. Her expression was the expression she wore when she was processing something carefully, not blank, but still, in the particular way of a person who is thinking faster than their face can show. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know." He nodded. He'd expected that. He'd known she'd known. But there was something in the saying of it, her saying it, him acknowledging it. The two of them standing in the kitchen having this specific exchange, that completed something. Put a shape around something that had been shapeless. She said, "You should have told me." Not with anger, not with the accumulated weight of everything she could have put behind it. Just plainly, the way she said most things. He said, "I know." She turned back to her tea. He stayed at the counter for another moment. Then he said her name, just her name, the way he'd said it in the hospital on the fourth day when the serious part was resolving, and when she looked up he said, "I'm sorry. About more than the heart thing." She held his gaze for a long moment. There are things that can't be accepted immediately even when they're real. Even when the person you've been waiting to hear say something says the thing. There's a process that has to happen before you can actually receive it. Alina understood this about herself. She understood that the sorry, even if she believed it, and she was not yet certain about the believing, even if she believed it, it didn't undo 12 years of not being looked at. It didn't undo the dinner table. It didn't undo the 22 years of what the marriage had become. But it was something, she said. "I know that too." And she went back to her tea, and he stood at the counter for another moment, and then he went to his office, and the door was left open. There was a dinner. This one was different, not a business dinner. A smaller thing, just the two of them and another couple. Old friends of Elena's from before, which meant from before the marriage had contracted to its current dimensions, which meant people who knew an Elena that Dante had perhaps lost track of. The couple was a woman named Marta, who Elena had known since she was 23, and Marta's husband, a man named Gio, who was the kind of straightforwardly decent person who makes everyone in the room more comfortable simply by being in it. They were warm in the particular way of people who have never needed to perform warmth, because they have always simply been warm. Marta had the specific quality of a person who genuinely loves the people they love, visibly, without complication. She had been worried about Elena for years. Not in a way she said directly. Marta understood Elena well enough to know that direct worry of the wrong kind was not wanted and would not help, but in the specific, quiet way of a person who watches their friend become smaller over time and doesn't know how to address it and keeps watching. When Elena had called her during the 9 days, not crying, not breaking down, but calling, which was itself significant because Elena didn't call people for nothing. Marta had understood something had shifted, and she had come to the hospital twice and sat with Elena in the waiting area in the way that good friends sit with you, in waiting areas, just present, not filling the silence with the wrong things, bringing coffee and not requiring conversation. Elena cooked again. Something different this time, lighter, with a flavor combination that she'd been thinking about for weeks, something that used the preserved lemons she'd made from the tree in the garden. Dante sat at the table, at the side, not at the head, and he listened. This was the thing he noticed himself doing, and the noticing was its own kind of education. He listened to his wife talk. Marta was asking her about the reading, about what she'd been reading, and Elena was talking about it with a specificity and engagement that, and this is the part that was uncomfortable to sit with, surprised him, not because he'd thought she was unintelligent. He'd never thought that, but because he'd lost track of the specifics of her intelligence. He'd stopped updating his understanding of her as a person. He'd been operating on a version of her that was years out of date, and the version sitting across the table was not that person. She was talking about a book. He didn't know the book, which was itself information, and she was making a point about it that was genuinely interesting. Gio leaned forward. Marta laughed, not at the point but in recognition of it. The way people laugh when something articulates exactly what they'd been thinking but hadn't found the words for. Dante watched. Marta said something to him, a casual, social bridge, pulling him into the conversation. She said, "Elena tells me you're doing better. We were so worried." Dante looked at Elena. Elena looked at the table for a moment and then back up at Marta. "He's doing very well," she said. And then, with the specific, measured quality that was simply her voice, not performing anything, not making a point, just saying a true thing, she added, "He's been taking very good care of himself." Marta smiled. Gio refilled the wine. The conversation moved. Dante sat with it. She had told them she was worried. Which meant she had told Marta, who was her friend, who she spoke to. Which meant that underneath the contained, efficient navigation of the hospital days, and the return home, and the lemon tree conversation, she had been frightened. She had felt something specific, and she had carried it in her particular way, which was quietly and without display, and she had talked to someone she trusted about it. She had been afraid of losing him. He had spent 22 years in this marriage, and he had at some point made a working assumption, the way you make working assumptions about all the background elements of your life, that she was simply there, that her presence was a given, that it would continue regardless of anything he did or didn't do, because it had continued regardless of everything he'd done or hadn't done, and so the continuation was simply what happened. He sat at that dinner table, in the warmth of the kitchen she'd cooked in, and the company of people who were hers rather than his, and he felt the full weight of that assumption, of how much he had taken, of how small the things were that he had given in return. He thought about the joke at the dinner party. He thought about the laughter. He picked up his wine glass, and he held it for a moment, and he put it back down. Later that night, after Marta and Gio had left, and the kitchen was cleared, and Alina was getting ready for bed, Dante sat in the living room with the lights low, and he stayed there for a long time, not doing anything, not looking at his phone, just sitting with the particular weight of an evening that had given him something to think about. He was trying to remember the last time he had sat in a room with people who were specifically Alina's, her friends, her world, the specific ecosystem of relationships she had built and maintained entirely independently of him. He could not remember. He could not place a single evening in the recent years where he had been in the presence of people who were hers. This meant one of two things. Either she had been keeping those worlds separate, which was its own kind of information, or she hadn't been having those evenings, which was a different kind of information. He thought about which it was. He thought about the quality of Marta's warmth toward Alina, the specific, sustained quality of it, the particular attention, the way Gio had looked at Alina when she was talking, not with any particular significance, just with the uncomplicated attention of a man who respects and is interested in the person speaking. The way both of them had been, simply, glad she was there. He thought about the fact that he had, in recent years, not been glad she was there. He had not been ungrateful for her presence, exactly. He had not wanted her gone, but glad, the active present, specific gladness of someone being happy that another person exists in their space. That was not a thing he had been, in relation to Elena, for a long time. He sat with this. He sat with it for a long time, which, spring came. Elena's garden, which she had tended alone for years, began its seasonal opening. The lemon tree, which had benefited from the watering adjustment, had a good year. There were other things, she had added things, slowly. Over the previous months, plants she'd been thinking about for a while, and hadn't bothered to discuss because there was nobody to discuss them with. She showed him. He didn't know anything about gardens. He knew this, and he said so, which was itself a form of progress. He was getting better at saying what he didn't know. She showed him anyway. She had the specific pleasure of an expert explaining their domain to someone who is genuinely, if ignorantly, interested. He asked questions. Some of them were the wrong questions, the questions of a person who doesn't yet understand what matters in a domain. But they were real questions, which she answered, and over the course of a Saturday afternoon in the garden in the early spring, something shifted again. Another small increment. Another degree. He touched the bark of the lemon tree. She watched him do it. He said, "It's solid," she said. "It has a good root system." He nodded. He was looking at the tree. He said, "How long does it take to get a root system like that?" She looked at the tree. "Longer than you'd think," she said. and you mostly have to leave it alone to do it. You can't rush it." He turned and looked at her. She was still looking at the tree. He said her name. She turned. There was something in the way he was looking at her that was different from the hospital, different from the kitchen when he'd said sorry. The hospital had been relief and the kitchen had been contrition. This was something else. This was the look of a man who is seeing a person, actually seeing the full weight of genuine attention, possibly for the first time in a very long time. She held it for a moment. Then she said, "The thyme needs cutting. Come and see." She walked toward the other part of the garden. He followed. That was the thing about this particular spring. He followed. Not dramatically. Not with any announcement or declaration. He just followed her through the garden that afternoon, and she showed him things, and he looked at them. And they spent 3 hours in the garden and came inside when the light started going. And she made something simple for dinner, and he opened wine, and they sat at the table together. Not at opposite ends. He helped with the dishes that night, not because she asked. He simply stood up and carried his plate and hers to the sink and stood there. She looked at him. He looked at the dish soap. "I don't actually know how you do this," he said. She almost smiled. "It's dishes," she said, "not surgery." "I'm aware," he said. "I still don't know how you do it." She showed him. They washed the dishes together. He was, by any objective measure, not skilled at it. But he tried, and he didn't pretend to be better at it than he was. And something in the trying, in the specific, undefended quality of being bad at something in front of another person and continuing anyway, was a small and genuine thing. She filed it. In the same quiet way she filed everything. The months that followed were the work, not the dramatic kind of work. Not the confrontational, therapeutic, everything laid on the table kind of work that movies favor because it has shape and catharsis and a clear before and after. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't have a visible arc. The kind that consists of 1,000 small decisions made consistently over time, each one almost invisible on its own, collectively building something that is hard to see from inside. He stopped making the jokes. That was one of the decisions. Not dramatically. He didn't stand up and announce a policy change. He simply stopped. And the stopping was noticed, in his particular world, by people who had operated with a certain set of assumptions about the available range of behavior. Nobody said anything. Nobody needed to. He started taking his medication consistently. He started sleeping at more regular hours. He started doing the specific small physical things the cardiologist had outlined. Nothing dramatic. Just the accumulation of daily choices that either support a body or don't. He asked Elana to help him with the diet changes. This is smaller than it sounds, and also larger than it sounds. Smaller because in practical terms it just meant some conversations about food and some adjustments to what she cooked. Larger because asking for help was, for Dante Caruso, a genuine act of vulnerability. He did it awkwardly. He didn't do it well. He came at it sideways, framed it technically. "I'm supposed to reduce certain things, and I don't know what." But she heard what was underneath the framing, and she responded to that rather than the framing itself, which was its own kind of grace. She started teaching him small things, what she was using and why. The logic of certain combinations. He was not a natural learner in this domain. His relationship with food had always been consumption rather than understanding, but he tried. He asked questions that were more and more genuine as the weeks passed. He started to see the structure in it, the intelligence that she brought to it. In the same way you start to see a painting, once you've stopped looking through it. There was a morning, this was late spring, perhaps May, when he came into the kitchen earlier than usual, before she'd started cooking, and she was at the counter with her coffee and a book. In her early morning hours, the ones that were hers. She looked up when he came in, and there was a moment of surprise, not alarm, but genuine surprise, the involuntary expression of a person who has been alone in a space and finds it is no longer alone. He said, "I couldn't sleep." She said, "Do you want coffee?" He said, "Wes." She made it. She handed it to him. He stood at the counter and she went back to her book. not in a dismissive way. She didn't close it or set it aside in the pointed manner of someone who is demonstrating that they're accommodating an intrusion. She simply continued. He stood at the counter with his coffee and looked out the window at the garden, which was in its full spring expression, and they were in the kitchen together in the early morning quiet, and neither of them said anything for a while. It was not uncomfortable. This was, in its own small way, significant. The last time they had been in a room together in silence without it being uncomfortable was a very long time ago. Silence between people who have run out of things to say is a particular kind of heavy. Silence between people who are simply present together is something else entirely. The distinction is almost impossible to articulate, but completely impossible to miss. He eventually asked what she was reading. She told him. He listened. She talked about it for a few minutes, not performing, not demonstrating, just talking about the thing she'd been reading the way you talk about something you find interesting when someone asks. He asked a question. She answered. He asked another. The coffee cooled in his cup while he was listening. She noticed this and didn't comment on it, but she noticed it and filed it and held it in the specific, careful way she held all the things that told her something true. The following October, a full year, almost exactly from the dinner, they had people over again. The same configuration, similar group. Business dinner in the way these things always were, implicit rather than explicit. The house, the table, the wine. Alana cooked. She made the lamb dish again, the one with the pomegranate. She had been thinking about it for weeks, turning it over, and she had made one change to it. One single adjustment that she had arrived at through the same process she always used, the long, careful process of attention and revision and understanding the logic of things. She served it. There was a moment, and she noticed this moment. She filed it with the same quiet precision. She filed everything. There was a moment, after the first few bites, where the conversation at the table stopped in a particular way. Not because it had been interrupted, but because something had demanded pause. Something in the plates. Richie, the same man who had been there the year before, who had the assessing quality of attention, put down his fork and said, "Elena." He said it the way you say a name when you want to indicate that the name is insufficient. This is remarkable. There was a murmur. Agreement. Real agreement. Elena looked at the table for a moment. And then Dante from his place at the table, not at the head, Dante looked down the table at her and said, "She's been making this for years." He said it as a fact. A simple statement, not directed at the room for effect, not performed. Just directed at her, and then let fall, for the room to do with what it would. She met his gaze. Nobody at the table would have characterized that moment as significant. It was just a husband saying something about his wife's cooking. Small. Normal. The kind of exchange that happens in hundreds of houses on any given evening. But Elena held it. Held the specific quality of the looking. The acknowledgement. The you exist and I see that quality of it, she said. It's better this year. I changed something, he said. What? She told him. The table moved on around them, plates and wine and the circling conversation. But in that particular exchange, 7 or 8 words, nothing more, something had completed. A circuit had closed, not everything. Not the whole 22 years. Not the dinner party joke or the 12 years of not looking. Not the heart thing or the knowing and not saying. But something. What Richie said to Dante, after the dinner, in the brief private moment between the end of the meal and the departure of the guests, was this, he said, "She is remarkable." He was not talking about the food. Dante looked at him. Richie was a man who had, in the decades of their association, said very few things directly. He operated in the particular language of implication and suggestion that was the native tongue of the world they inhabited. When he said something plainly, it carried the specific weight of a thing that has been considered carefully before being offered. Dante said, "Yes," Richie said. Some men figure that out early, some figure it out late. He looked at his hands for a moment. The ones who figure it out at all are the lucky ones. He said good night. He left. Dante stood in the hallway of his house and listened to the sound of the guests departing, and thought about what Richie had said, and thought about the specific quality of the word lucky, and what it meant to be the recipient of something you hadn't earned. Alina came out of the kitchen. She was carrying the last of the glasses. He said, "Let me." She looked him. He took the glasses. She let him. There are no clean endings in real marriages. There are no endpoints where the work is done, and the story closes, and the lesson is learned, and the credits roll. There is only the next day, and the choices made in it, and the next day after that. There is only the accumulation of small decisions, the tiny adjustments, the pausing to notice, and the choosing to speak, and the learning, again and again, to receive. Elena Caruso had built herself out of a long time of not being seen into something that was entirely her own. Something solid. Something with a good root system. Something that had taken longer than you'd think, and that had grown, mostly, by being left alone to do it. Dante Caruso had spent decades becoming a man that rooms organized themselves around, and then he had been on a hospital bed, and a woman who he had systematically made invisible had moved through 4 seconds of complete choice and had chosen, with the competence and steadiness that were entirely hers, to keep him alive. He had not deserved that. He was trying now to understand what deserving even means in the context of a marriage. Whether it's the right frame at all. Whether people in long relationships are ever really giving each other what the other deserves, or whether what they're doing is something more complicated, something that includes history and patience and the particular intelligence of knowing a person through their worst as well as everything else. He was not certain about any of this. He was 52 now. He was learning to be uncertain. Elena was 45. She got up every morning and she made the decisions she made, including the decision to stay, which she made not out of obligation or out of the momentum of 22 years of marriage, but out of something she was still working out how to name. A recognition, maybe, of the thing she had always known about this man underneath the man he had constructed, that it was still there, the original person, available if conditions were right, if someone was patient enough, if someone paid enough attention. She had paid that attention for a very long time, and whatever he was now, whatever he was in the process of becoming, slowly and imperfectly and with significant backsliding, she had had a hand in that. Not in the way he'd had a hand in shaping her. His shaping of her had been subtractive. What she had done was something else. Something that worked with what was already there, the way you work with a root system that already exists but hasn't been given what it needs. She watered. She adjusted. She paid attention. She was still deciding whether that was enough. 2. There is a thing that happens in long marriages, in the ones that survive the middle passage, the years when the initial structure has worn through, and what's underneath is either something real or the appearance of something real, and distinguishing between the two requires more courage than most people have ready to hand. There is a thing that happens when two people who have been coexisting, orbiting each other in the specific mechanical way of long habit, suddenly find themselves actually looking at each other again. It is not comfortable. It is not romantic, in the way the word romantic implies ease and warmth and the uncomplicated pleasure of connection. It is something harder than that. It is two people who know each other's worst, who have seen the lowest expression of what the other person is capable of, choosing to continue to look, choosing to remain present, not out of obligation, not out of the inertia of shared history, but out of the specific, difficult, ongoing decision to be in this. Elena and Dante Caruso were in the early stages of this. Early stages means the ground was not yet solid. Early stages means the habits of the old patterns still exerted themselves, still made their presence known. Early stages means there were still evenings when she sat at the kitchen table after he'd gone to his office, and she thought about the years and felt the weight of them, and was uncertain whether what was happening was real, or whether she was simply hoping again, which she had trained herself out of, and which, she noticed, she was in the process of untrained herself back into. The untrained was uncomfortable, as it always is, As all genuine growth is, she had a conversation with Marta about this. Not all of it. She was not a person who laid everything out in the particular way that some women do, the full emotional inventory, every layer examined. She gave Marta the shape of it, the fact of the shift she could feel, the uncertainty about whether it was real, the specific discomfort of hoping again after a long period of not hoping. Marta listened to this and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You already saved his life. You know that, right? You don't have to save the marriage too. You can just see what it is." Elena thought about this for a long time after. You can just see what it is, not perform it. Not decide in advance whether it works, not commit to an outcome. Just look at the thing as it is and continue making decisions based on what you see. This was, she realized, essentially what she was already doing. She had been doing it for months, taking each day as its own data point, not rushing toward a conclusion, not retreating into the protection of no expectation either, just watching, just seeing. It turned out that this was, for her, enough for now. The lemon tree that November had more fruit on it than any previous year. Elena stood in the garden in the cold morning, early with her coffee, and she looked at it. The branches were heavy. The fruit was bright against the grey November light, the specific vivid yellow that has no parallel in any other shade, insistent, present, certain of itself. Dante came out of the house with his own coffee. He had started doing this, joining her in the mornings sometimes, in the specific way of someone learning a new practice, uncertain still of whether it's wanted, but trying, and he stood beside her. They looked at the tree. He said, "More than last year." She said, "Yes." They stood there for a moment in the cold morning, and the tree stood there with its insistent yellow fruit, and the garden was quiet around them, and the house was behind them, and the year was almost done. He said, "What do you do with them? When there are this many?" She thought about it. "You preserve some," she said. "You give some away, you use some in things." She looked at the tree. "You don't waste any." He nodded. He was holding his coffee with both hands against the cold. She was doing the same. They were not touching, but they were close enough to be in each other's warmth. He said, "I wasted a lot." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "not forgiving, not absolving, not performing generosity in the specific way of someone who wants credit for their grace. Just yes. True, this is what happened. We are here now in the cold, looking at the tree," he said. "I know it's not a simple thing to fix." She said, "Nunk. I'm going to keep trying anyway." She looked at the tree for a long moment. "I know," she said. They stood in the garden for another few minutes. The cold was real and their coffee was warm, and the tree was heavy with its yellow fruit, and the morning was going to be the morning regardless of what either of them said or didn't say. The year had almost run its course. The tree had done what trees do when given what they need. It had grown and borne fruit, and stood solid in the ground with its root system deep, and its branches reaching in every available direction toward the light. Elena looked at the tree. She looked at the year. At all of it, the dinner, the joke, the laughter, the 4 seconds in the doorway, the 9 days, the tea, the kitchen, the sorry, the questions, the dishes, the garden, the open door, the accumulation of it, the specific texture of a year that had contained all of that and produced, not resolution, not transformation, not the clean ending of something repaired, but something more honest than any of those. A beginning, tentative and uncertain, and still carrying the weight of everything that came before it, but a beginning. She turned and went back inside to start breakfast. He stayed for a moment longer looking at the tree, and then he followed her in. Took, the morning is ordinary. The tree is ordinary. The man following the woman into the kitchen of the house they have lived in for 22 years. This is ordinary. This is the texture of a life. Not the dramatic moments, not the hospital beds, and the 4 seconds of choice, and the sorry in the kitchen. Those are the hinges. But the doors themselves are made of this, of mornings and coffee and the weight of fruit on a branch that has had, finally, enough water. He follows her in. She is already at the counter, already beginning the small, intelligent work of mourning. He sets down his cup. He says, "What can I do?" She pauses for just a moment, the briefest beat, and then she reaches into the refrigerator and sets something on the counter and says, "You can do the lemons." He looks at them. He picks one up. He holds it for a moment. "How?" he says. She shows him. He is not good at it. He is slow, and he holds the knife incorrectly, and the first one comes out unevenly. She doesn't take it back from him. She shows him the adjustment, not correcting, just showing, and he tries again. This one is better, not good, but better. The third one is better than the second. She starts the other parts of breakfast while he does the lemons. They work in the kitchen in the morning, quiet, the coffee cooling on the counter, the cold garden visible through the window. The fruit is bright on the cutting board, vivid yellow under the kitchen light. There is something passing between them, in this ordinary kitchen, in this ordinary morning, that is almost impossible to name precisely. Something about the presence of two people in a shared space, doing a shared task, and neither of them performing it. Neither of them executing a role. Just two people in a kitchen, making breakfast. It is the smallest possible thing. It is also, given everything, exactly what it needs to be. Later that day, she would preserve some of the lemons from the tree. This is a patient process. You cut and you salt and you seal and you wait. You cannot rush it. The preservation takes weeks, the salt working its slow alchemy, breaking down the bitterness, drawing out the complex undertones, turning something raw and sharp into something deep and layered and full of the particular flavor that can only come from the long process of salt and time and waiting. You pack them into jars. You make sure the seal is good. You put them somewhere cool and dark and you leave them. You check them sometimes. You open the lid and smell and look and assess, but mostly you leave them. Mostly you trust the process. Weeks later they're ready. And what you have then is something that doesn't taste like a lemon anymore. Not quite. It tastes like what a lemon becomes when it has been transformed by time and the right conditions into something richer and more complex and more useful than the original ingredient. You add it to things. It deepens them. It brings a brightness that is not harsh, a complexity that is not overwhelming. It makes things better in a way that is hard to point to and say there. That's the thing that changed it. It just makes things better. Elena stood at the kitchen counter that afternoon, packing the lemons into jars, and she thought about this, about the process of it, about what the parallel was, and whether pursuing the parallel was too neat, too self-conscious, too much like the kind of meaning, making that real life rarely accommodates as cleanly as stories do. She decided it was a little too neat. She decided she was okay with that. She sealed the jars. She put them in the cool, dark place where they needed to go. She wrote the date on the lids. This was important. You needed to know how long a thing had been in process. And she straightened up and looked at the row of jars with the yellow fruit and the dark brine, and she felt, without analyzing it, something that was simply good, not resolved, not repaired, not finished, just good, present, here, in this kitchen with these lemons on this November afternoon, in this year that had been what it had been. Good. There is a version of this story that ends with a grand gesture. There is a version where Dante Caruso stands up at a dinner table in front of all the same people who had been there a year before and makes a speech, eloquent, specific, acknowledging exactly what he'd done and exactly what she'd given and exactly what it meant, where he names it publicly, where he gives her, in front of a room, the recognition that the room had denied her. That version is satisfying in the way that symmetry is satisfying. The wound delivered in public, healed in public. The circle closing completely. That version did not happen. What happened instead was smaller and more true. What happened was a year of mornings, a year of questions that were more and more genuine, a year of an open door, a year of dishes washed not well but together, a year of the garden being, for the first time, shared rather than solely hers, a year of a man learning, late and imperfectly, and with significant backsliding to receive, a year of a woman deciding each morning to see what the day was rather than deciding in advance. This is what real repair looks like. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't have a moment where you can point and say, there, that's when it changed. It accumulates. It accretes. It is built, like a root system, by the slow and patient and mostly invisible work of daily decision. Alina understood this. She had always understood this. She was a person who understood how things held together, what made them work. She understood it about food and about gardens, and about the specific, patient process of preservation. She had simply not been certain, for a long time, that the thing was worth preserving. She was still not certain, but she was still here, which was its own kind of answer. And he was still here, which was also, given everything, its own kind of answer. What the story is, in the end, is not a story about a man who was saved. It is a story about a woman who chose, when the choice was entirely hers, to save him. Not because she owed it to him. She did not. Not because the marriage obligated her. It did not. She had been released from any reasonable obligation by a decade of being systematically unseen. Not because she was performing a virtue or executing a role or doing what was expected of her. She chose it because she chose it. Because in 4 seconds of complete, available choice, she looked at the man who had laughed at the dinner table, and the man who had looked at his phone, and the man who had needed her to be invisible, and she also looked at the man who was in the office with a pen in his hand and grey in his face, and breath that was wrong, and she understood that all of those men were the same man, and that the same man was her husband, and that her husband needed her, and that she was capable of the need being met. She chose competence over paralysis. She chose presence over distance. She chose, in the most fundamental and unremarkable and profound way, to be there. This is not a small thing. This is not the thing you do when you are a woman who has accepted her situation and made her peace with it. This is the thing you do when you have built, out of 22 years of not being seen, a self that is entirely and irreducibly yours, a self with a root system that goes down deep, that holds in cold weather, that produces fruit in good years and bad years both, that is, in the most complete sense, solid. She saved his life. Then she went back to her book, and in the morning she got up and had her coffee, and the lemon tree was in the garden, and her husband was alive, and her life was her own, as it had always been her own, regardless of what any room had decided to see or not see. She was there. She had always been there. That was the whole story, and it was enough. The lemon tree is still there. It has more fruit on it now than ever before. The branches are heavy in the season when they should be heavy, and the roots go down into the dark earth where nobody sees them and hold everything above ground in place. Elena is still there. She reads in the mornings and tends the garden and cooks with the specific intelligence that nobody at those early dinners named, and that has not diminished by 1 degree because nobody named it. She talks to Marta. She goes through her days with the particular, grounded quality of a person who has found, through the long and difficult process of not being seen, exactly who she is. Dante is still there. He takes his medication. He asks questions. He goes into the garden sometimes in the mornings and stands with his coffee and looks at the tree. He is learning, late and imperfectly, what it costs to not see someone, what accretes in the years of looked-through-ness, what it asks of a person to keep being present in the face of it. He is learning this from her, not because she teaches it overtly, not because she sits him down and explains it. She teaches it by being, consistently and without drama, exactly herself, by continuing to occupy the space of her own life with complete authority, by naming what needs to be named and moving on, by being in every room she enters, genuinely and entirely present. This is the thing she has always done. It only looks different now because someone is finally watching. The morning is ordinary. The kitchen is warm. The tree is heavy with its yellow fruit. And somewhere in this unremarkable house, on this unremarkable morning, a man is learning to hold a lemon correctly. And a woman is watching him learn. And she is deciding again, as she decides every morning, that this is worth the time it takes. The day continues. The roots hold.